What if the final years of Queen Elizabeth II were not defined by quiet dignity, but by a silent war unfolding behind palace walls, where every word was treated like evidence and every call felt like a potential betrayal? Because that is exactly what this explosive dossier suggests, and once you see the pattern, it becomes impossible to ignore. For years, the public believed the distance between Prince Harry and the crown was emotional, complicated, maybe even tragic. But what if it was something colder, something calculated? What if it wasn't just a family falling apart, but an institution going into full defensive lockdown against one of its own? Picture this moment. A quiet summer morning inside Buckingham Palace. The phone rings. Not just any call. It's Harry calling his grandmother, but she doesn't answer. Not immediately. She pauses, watches, waits. Why? Because, according to the revelations linked to Hugo Vickers, this was no longer a simple conversation. It was a controlled operation, a system, a protocol, a setup where nothing was left unrecorded, nothing left unverified. Let that sink in. The Queen, who spent decades navigating world leaders without fear, suddenly refused to speak to her own grandson without witnesses present. Not once, not twice, every single time. That's not caution. That's collapse of trust. And the reason? It wasn't whispered disagreements or private tensions. It was fear. Fear that every word, every soft moment, every I love you could be captured, edited, and broadcast to the world within hours. Not as truth, but as content. Think about that shift. Harry wasn't just a grandson anymore. In her eyes, he had become something else entirely. A risk, a liability, a potential leak. And suddenly, everything changes. The palace doesn't operate on emotions, it operates on survival. And when the Oprah interview detonated across global media, something inside the monarchy snapped. Quietly, permanently. Harry wasn't just distanced. He was flagged, internally categorized as a security concern. That's not gossip. That's a chilling reclassification. Imagine the weight of that moment. A grandmother looking at her grandson and seeing not family, but exposure. And it didn't stop there. Every call from California was filtered, logged, monitored, archived. No direct lines, no private conversations. The monarchy had turned into a fortress, and Harry was no longer inside. It was defending against him. But here's where it gets even darker. This wasn't just about protection. It was about pain. Deep, silent, unspoken pain. Because behind the precision, behind the protocols, behind the cold machinery of control, was a woman who had spent 70 years protecting the crown, now watching its most intimate secrets being sold piece by piece. And the question lingers like a shadow: when did love turn into liability? Because if you follow the timeline, the cracks didn't appear overnight. They were there from the beginning. Subtle, symbolic, almost invisible until you connect them. The wedding, the dress, the color. To the world, it was flawless, elegant, iconic, but inside palace walls, it was something else entirely. A signal, a quiet rebellion, a moment that didn't align with centuries of carefully guarded tradition. And Meghan Markle wasn't just entering the system, she was rewriting it. At first, it looked like confidence, modernization, change. But to the Queen, it raised a different question entirely. If the rules could be bent on day one, what happens next? That question never went away. It grew louder with every incident, every headline, every shift in tone, until eventually it wasn't about interpretation anymore. It was about control slipping through fingers that had never lost grip before. And then came the moment that changed everything. The Oprah interview, not just a broadcast, a turning point, a fracture that split the monarchy's internal reality from its public image. While the world watched emotional revelations unfold, inside the palace, something colder was activated. A strategy not of retaliation, but containment. Recollections may vary. 4 words: calm, measured, controlled. But beneath them, a storm. Because that statement wasn't just diplomacy, it was a counter move. A signal that the crown would not engage emotionally, but it would defend itself structurally. And from that point forward, there was no going back. Every interaction became calculated, every move analyzed, every silence intentional. Harry thought he was calling his grandmother, but in reality, he was reaching an institution that had already drawn its line. And as 2021 faded into 2022, the tension didn't ease, it escalated quietly, ruthlessly, building toward moments that would redefine everything we thought we understood about loyalty, duty, and betrayal. Because what happened next wasn't just distance, it was isolation, complete. And the real breaking point, the moment where everything finally shattered, was still ahead. And just when it seemed like the damage had already gone too far, 2022 arrived like a slow, inevitable collapse. The kind where nothing explodes all at once, but everything quietly falls apart piece by piece until there's nothing left to hold together. Because by this point, the monarchy wasn't reacting anymore. It was anticipating. Every move from Prince Harry and Meghan Markle was no longer seen as unpredictable. It was expected, mapped, almost studied like a pattern that had already revealed its endgame. And the deeper you look into the timeline revealed through Hugo Vickers, the clearer it becomes this wasn't chaos. This was a sequence, a chain reaction that had been building since the very beginning. The Platinum Jubilee should have been a moment of unity, a celebration of a reign that defined an era. But instead, it became a visual message so cold, so precise, it didn't need words. Harry and Meghan weren't front and center. They weren't even part of the core frame. They were placed behind, physically, symbolically, unmistakably. Not working royals, not central figures, just present. And barely that. The cameras didn't need to zoom in. The distance said everything. The monarchy had quietly reclassified them, not as insiders, but as outsiders observing a system they once belonged to. And if that moment felt like a warning, what came next felt like a door closing. September 2022, 3 days before the end. A final invitation. Not public, not political, personal. Queen Elizabeth II asking her grandson to come to Balmoral. One last chance, one final moment that could have rewritten everything. No cameras, no narratives, just presence. And he didn't go. Think about that not as a headline, but as a moment frozen in time. A woman who had ruled for 70 years, now in her final days, extending a private hand, and that hand left unanswered. The reasons? Disputes, conditions, arguments over whether Meghan would be included. Details that, in the grand scheme of life and death, suddenly feel painfully small. 72 hours later, the call came, the moment no one could reverse. The Queen was gone, and Harry, he arrived too late. Not dramatically late, not hours and hours, just enough to miss the goodbye, just enough to carry that silence forever. And that's where something shifts from conflict into consequence. Because from that moment on, this wasn't about reconciliation anymore. It was about aftermath. January 2023. The memoir Spare drops like a controlled detonation. Every page, every revelation, every private detail exposed to the world, not just as memory, but as narrative. And inside the palace, there's no response, no counterattack, no emotional reaction, just silence. Total. Absolute. Strategic silence. Because when an institution reaches that point, it doesn't argue anymore. It withdraws. And by 2025, the consequences began to formalize. Quietly, legally. Patronages gone. Titles reduced in meaning. Access restricted beyond recognition. No dramatic announcements. No confrontations. Just a slow erasure of relevance from the system Harry once stood at the center of. And then came April 2026. The moment that reframed everything. When Hugo Vickers documented what he described as the Queen's final judgment, not in anger, not in rage, but in 2 words so restrained they cut deeper than any public condemnation ever could. Besotted. Weak. That was it. No elaborate criticism, no detailed accusation, just a quiet assessment from a woman who had spent her entire life choosing duty over emotion, watching someone she loved choose the opposite. And suddenly, the story shifts again, because this isn't just about actions anymore, it's about transformation. How does a man who served in combat zones, who stood as a symbol of discipline and service, become someone described in those terms? What changed? When did it change? And more importantly, how? The dossier calls it something chillingly simple. The childminder effect, a phrase that sounds almost harmless until you understand what it implies. A step-by-step dismantling of identity, not overnight, not forcefully, but gradually. First comes isolation, the idea that everything you once trusted is against you, that your family isn't support, it's threat, that the only safe place is away from it all. Then comes the break, the military roles, the identity, the structure that defined Harry for years, gone, not reduced, removed, and with it the one place where he wasn't a prince, just a soldier, just a man judged by merit, not title. And once that foundation disappears, what's left? Redirection. From global figure to supporting role, from independent voice to aligned narrative, from individual identity to something else, something shaped, something controlled, not loudly, not obviously, but completely. And when the Queen reportedly looked at a photograph of her grandson and whispered that haunting line, one minute he is the captain general, the next he is just a childminder, it wasn't mockery. trickery. It was recognition. Recognition that the person she once knew had changed in a way she couldn't reverse. But even that wasn't the end of it. Because while the emotional and symbolic fractures were unfolding publicly, something far more disturbing was happening behind closed doors, inside the Queen's private medical records. Patterns began to appear, not speculation, documentation, episodes of exhaustion, sudden weight loss, insomnia that didn't match her previous condition, and then the most unsettling detail of all, timing. These episodes often followed calls from California, not gentle conversations, not quiet check-ins, but intense exchanges, discussions of money, media deals, upcoming releases, pressure layered on pressure, at a time when the Queen was already carrying the weight of an entire institution and the loss of her husband. Let that reality settle in. A 96-year-old monarch, managing a nation, facing her final years, and simultaneously dealing with what insiders described as a psychological siege coming from her own family. And still, she said nothing publicly, not because there was nothing to say, but because saying it would damage the very institution she had spent her life protecting. That silence? It wasn't weakness. It was sacrifice. But behind that silence, plans were being made. Quietly, carefully, strategically. Because as we reach the final pages of this unfolding story, something emerges that changes everything again. A hidden directive, a sealed instruction, a final move that wasn't about the past, but about the future. The Balmoral Directive, a document reportedly dictated in the Queen's final hours. Not emotional, not sentimental. Strategic, specific, a contingency plan for what happens if Harry ever attempts to return. And at the center of it, a decision so absolute it could redefine the monarchy's stance forever. A line drawn, not in public, but in private. One that could permanently block Meghan Markle from ever stepping back into royal space, no matter what happens next. And that document? It's sealed, locked away, meant to stay hidden for decades. But now, cracks are forming. And the question isn't just what happened in the past anymore, it's what happens next. Because if the institution has already decided the ending, then everything we're seeing right now might just be the final chapters playing out exactly as planned. And the most unsettling part? We may not even realize when the final door officially closes.